that and urge my colleagues on the other side to coalesce around that idea, and let's say to the students of America that as the United States Senate, we know a good idea when we can see one, and the Bermanchin proposal is such an amendment. I thank the President. I yield the floor.
Under the previous order, the Senate will proceed to executive session to consider the following nomination, which the clerk will report.
Nomination: Jennifer A. Dorsey of Nevada to be United States District Judge.
Under the previous order, there will be 1 hour for debate, equally divided in the usual form.
Mr. President.
Senator from Washington.
Mr. President, I have 3 unanimous consent requests for committees to meet during today's session of the Senate. They have the approval of the majority and minority leader, and I ask unanimous consent these requests be agreed to and be printed in the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. I ask unanimous consent to speak as if in morning business.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, we are here today because, unfortunately, the financial burden on our nation's college students dramatically spiked overnight 8 days ago, including over 100,000 students from my home state of Washington, where 56% of college graduates leave school with a student loan debt. And the average amount that they owe is more than $22,000. Just when they're getting started on their careers, instead of buying a house or buying a car or just paying the bills, their student loan bills are piling up with interest. And now, interest rates for federal student loans, which have been kept at a low rate of 3.4%, doubled to 6.8%. For these students and for millions of students across the country, that is a tax hike of $1,000. That is not fair to students, and it is certainly not good for our economy, and Congress does have to act to fix it. Now, this isn't just an abstract issue for me. It is very personal. Pell Grants and student loans were what allowed my 6 brothers and sisters and I to go to college after my dad got sick and had to leave his job. They are what made college affordable, and they are what allowed each one of us to pursue a career and give back to our communities. Because our government was there to help my family and help us through hard times, those 7 kids in my family grew up to be a firefighter, a lawyer, a computer programmer, a sports writer, a homemaker, a middle school teacher, and a United States Senator. In my book, that was a good investment by our country and our government. And my family's story is far from unique. In fact, last week, I traveled around my home state of Washington listening to student after student after student describe the real-life impact that this rate hike would have on them. Students like Elizabeth from Vancouver, Washington. She's a sophomore at the University of Washington. She comes from a family of 5 children with immigrant parents who work hourly, low-wage jobs. Growing up, she told me the idea of paying for college was overwhelming. But thanks to scholarships and grants and loans, she is able to pursue her dream of becoming a broadcast journalist. However, her part-time work-study position barely covers her bills, and she said she's constantly plagued by stress as she worries about how she's ever going to overcome what she called her, quote, debt sentence. Mr. President, the reality is this is a simple issue. College is already too expensive for students like Elizabeth, and Congress shouldn't make it worse. So I am very proud to join my colleagues in supporting the Keep Student Loan Rates Affordable Act to extend the 3.4% interest rate. And I urge our friends on the other side of the aisle to join us and pass it. With student loan rates now exceeding $1 trillion, students and their families deserve due process and thoughtful consideration of issues like financial aid. You know, students have already contributed billions to deficit reduction. But the problem is Senate Republican leadership has insisted in all of their proposals that we balance the budget on the backs of struggling students and their families. And so far, they have refused to put the interest of students and tomorrow's middle class ahead of tax code spending that benefits the wealthy. What they've introduced is a bill that includes no cap on how high student loan rates could go, something CBO tells us will mean students could be locked in at rates over 8% in just a few short years. In effect, It would be better to absolutely do nothing now than to take up and pass the Republican bill. You know, I bet everybody listening knows a family member or a coworker who is up to their neck in student debt. It is a weight that keeps them from helping to grow our economy or start a family or take risks with their careers. And it's a weight that is not easily shed. We can't continue to do this to generation after generation of college students and expect to be able to compete in the 21st century economy. We have to do everything we can to remove barriers to education, not erect new ones. The clock's run out. We need to act because for millions of Americans, affordable college has been the ticket to the middle class, and we really can't allow it to slip away. We can't allow access to college to become unattainable for so many of our families. So I urge our Republican colleagues to join us in investing in America's future by reversing the student loan increase and making college more affordable for America's middle class. Thank you, Mr. President, and I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Tennessee.
Mr. President, I'm glad I stayed to hear the senator from Washington speak because I think this highlights the issue. That's a terrific political speech, but it bears no resemblance to what's actually happening in the student loan debate. I mean, the distinguished senator from Washington talked about rates going up. Rates are going up for 6 million middle-income students in America who are going to be taking out loans this year. And the Democratic proposal does nothing for them, does nothing for them. All they're trying to do is for 1 year do a political fix for 40% of the students who are already the beneficiary of Pell Grants, as she so ably expressed, who have their interest paid while they're in college. These are the subsidized loans. These students may receive a Pell Grant of up to $5,500 or so. They may have their interest paid while they're in college. This whole accounting system that we're talking about, that the Congressional Budget Office has discussed, is done in a way that's very generous to students as opposed to taxpayers, because it's done under the Fair Credit Reporting Act, which is more generous to students in this case than taxpayers. But what about the 6 million middle-income students who are just swinging in the wind under the Democratic proposal? It does nothing for them. Now, on the other hand, you have the President of the United States, a Democrat. We have the House of Representatives, a majority Republican. They fundamentally agree on one idea. Let's have a permanent solution. Let's figure out what it costs the taxpayer to borrow money from the government, over $100 billion a year, and loan it to the students at no profit, so that the students can use it, all of them, not 40% of them, not just low-income students, middle-income students as well. All of them will have their rates lowered. So what would the effect be? Their proposal would fix for a year the student loan interest rate on 40% of the loans at 3.4%. Our proposal, the bipartisan proposal, fundamentally like the President's proposal and the House of Representatives' passed solution, the solution they've passed, would, for undergraduates, all undergraduates, lower the rate to 3.66%, not just for 40% of the students. It would be for middle-income students as well. And for graduate students as well, their rates would be lower than 6.8%. So what is good about a short-term political fix that makes middle-income students and graduate students pay more? Hundreds of millions of dollars more over the next 10 years. What's good about that? All it does is provide an opportunity to make a well-rehearsed political speech about student loans. We all want to encourage students to go to college. We're looking for a way to give them some predictability and some certainty, so that student doesn't have to worry when they graduate from Maryville High School in Tennessee, where I went. Well, Congress isn't going to get its job done. All they're going to do is stand up there and make political speeches that have nothing to do with the issue. In this case, the President's doing his job. He's recommended a long-term solution. The Republican House of Representatives has done its job. It passed a long-term solution that lowers rates for everybody. a group of 6 senators here doing our jobs, we've introduced a bipartisan proposal that reduces rates for everybody, and that's a long-term solution. But a number of the Democratic senators are playing political games. They're ignoring reality, and they're leaving 6 million students across this country who are middle income and who are headed to college. They're going to freeze in for 10 years higher rates on their loans, rates that are nearly twice as high as the bipartisan proposal here, which is fundamentally like the President's proposal and the House proposal. Now, what is the wisdom in that? What is the wisdom in that? I don't see it, Mr. President, and I don't think the students will see it. As far as balancing the budget on the back of students, the only people around here doing that have been the Democrats when they passed the health care law. They put in there a takeover of the federal student loan program, and according to the Congressional Budget Office, they had an amount of savings, $50 or $60 billion, and they used part of it to reduce the debt. So the CBO says these are savings because you took over student loans, and the Democrats said, we'll use it to reduce the debt, or use it on the Pell Grant program, and they use it to help pay for the health care law. Every single year for the next 5 years, 6 years, students are being overcharged to help pay for the health care law. So we want to get in a big political discussion about who's overcharging students in order to reduce the deficit or pay for the health care law. Well, we can have that. But that's not what we want to do. We want a result. And we've suggested to the Senate, and I'm going to say it one more time, instead of a 40% political fix for 1 year, for 40% of the students, we've suggested a long-term solution for 100% of the students. It reduces their rates. It cuts nearly in half the interest rate for every single undergraduate loan, every single one. That's 2/3 of the loans. And it's based on an idea that was in the President's budget that's already been passed by the House of Representatives and that's been introduced by 3 on that side of the aisle and 3 on this side of the aisle. Now, a Senate that was interested in a result instead of political gamesmanship would be sitting down and trying to work that out. That's what we want to do. Now, we can play games too, I suppose, and I can go get my statistics and I can come out and say, you over on the Democratic side, when you passed the health care bill, you did it on the backs of students. And when you balanced the budget, which you haven't done, you tried to do it on the backs of students. And when you found some money for the Pell Grants, you overcharged the people that you were loaning student loan money to. That's true. I could do that. I could say that, but I didn't come here to spend all my time saying that. I came here to get some results. So this isn't a game for 10 or 11 million students across this country. They are trying to figure out how they're going to pay for college. Just as the senator from Washington said, it's not easy to do. They expect us to come up here with our backgrounds and say, we're going to do the best we can. And isn't a good principle to say, instead of making this like what we call the doctor's fix, where we come in every year and play a little politics and add a little money to pay doctors who work with Medicare patients? That's really a terrible thing to do, but we do it every year. So we're going to make student loans in the same way. And in presidential election year, everybody will make a big speech about it. 10 or 11 million students will sit around wondering how they're going to pay for college and waiting for the people in Washington to make a decision about that. We shouldn't be doing that. We shouldn't be doing that. And we have great promise here. We have great promise here. I mean, we got a president making a long-term solution, a House of Representatives of a different party agreeing with him, and 6 of us on both sides of the aisle proposing a solution that is a permanent solution for 100% of the 10 or 11 million people who will be borrowing over $100 billion this year in 18 million loans. I mean, why would they, on the other side of the aisle, insist on a solution that forces 6 million, mostly middle-income students to pay 6.8% when they could be paying 3.66%? Why would you do that? Because you haven't thought about it, I think. Lots been going on. We've had an immigration debate. We're doing a lot of other things. So maybe senators haven't taken a look at that. I have. I've had a chance to do that. I've been president of a university. I've been the education secretary. I know something about the student loan program. I didn't like it when the federal government took it over. I admire our United States Secretary of Education. I don't think he ought to be the banker of the year. I think we have banks to make loans, but that's not the way it is. The taxpayers now make all the government loans, so it's over $100 billion a year. And what we are saying is students are making their plans. They're going to be arriving at college in August and September. We've got a bipartisan proposal that will lower interest rates for every single student taking out a student loan, yet our friends on the other side want to leave middle-income students out of it. Force them to pay twice as much in many cases as they should be in interest rates for the next 10 years. That makes no sense. We ought not to do it. So tomorrow what we ought to do is we should be passing the Burr-Manchin proposal that's supported on both sides of the aisle. To the extent it differs with the President's proposal, which is very slight, and with the House of Representatives proposal, which is not much, we should then sit down, work something out over the next 3 days, pass it, send it to the President, and go on to the next issue. Instead, we've got political speeches about how hard it is to go to college. We all know how hard it is to go to college. It's difficult to do. We all want to help. But if we have a solution, we ought to adopt it. So, Mr. President, I could play politics too. I know how. Every one of us knows how in this room. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here. This is not a time for playing politics. This is serious business. 10 million students getting 18 million loans, $100 billion plus from the American taxpayers. We have a proposal before us that is fair to the taxpayers, won't cost them any money. It's fair to the students. It doesn't balance the budget or pay for the health care program or any other thing on the student's back. And it gives students, many of whom who have no credit rating, no other way to get money, a chance to get several $1,000s a year at one of the lowest possible rates available in the country. One of the lowest possible rates in the country. And the proposal that's before the Senate that's bipartisan is a permanent solution. It says to the student going to the University of Tennessee or of Alaska or Minnesota, you get a loan this year from the government and you're an undergraduate, the interest rate's 3.66%, you've got it for 10 years. If you're a middle-income student, the Democrats' plan says it's 6.8%. And they say, wait for what? Wait for rates to go up? Why don't we establish this program for students at a time when rates are low? That's to their advantage. Let's have a permanent solution at a time when rates are low. And they may go up, and therefore students may pay more, but they'll pay a lot less more than they would if they're out in the private market. And they'll have a lot more certainty than if we just come around and play politics with this every year to try to gain some advantage with this student group or that student group. So, Mr. President, we have an opportunity before us. The immigration bill passed before the recess. It showed a good deal of ability of people on both sides of the aisle to work together. Did that with the Farm Bill, did that with the Water Resources Bill. I would submit this is 100 times easier than any of those bills. When I went home to Tennessee before the July 4th recess, I said to somebody who asked me, we're that far apart. And we've got the President, the Republican House, and a bipartisan group of senators all in about the same place. This ought to be easy to do. It's still easy to do. But I would implore my senators to look at the facts, those on the other side of the aisle, and realize I don't think you want to go home and explain why you're leaving 6 million middle-income students twisting in the wind, paying twice as much on interest rates for the next year as the proposal that you're about to vote against tomorrow. I think that'll be pretty hard to explain, and I'll bet there'll be a lot of explaining to do if that's the end result. So I pledge, as I've been working with Secretary Duncan, with the White House, with Democrats and Republicans, to try to get a result here. I think we can still do it in the next few days. I would hope we could have a vote on both proposals tomorrow. My guess would be both would fail at this point, but at least that would show that we're seriously working toward a solution, and we can sit down and merge these small differences we have between the bipartisan group here, the Republican House, and the President of the United States. I thank the President. I yield the floor. And notice the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. While we wait for a senator to come to the floor, some notes happening in the Senate today. The chamber is considering the nomination of attorney Jennifer Dorsey to be a U.S. District Court judge in Nevada. The vote on her nomination is scheduled for noon Eastern. Members will recess from 12:30 to 2:15 Eastern for their weekly party lunches. And also on the Senate's agenda this week, legislation to reverse the doubling of interest rates on federally subsidized student loans that took effect on July 1st. The Democratic proposal would restore the 3.4% interest rate on federally subsidized student loans for 1 year. A competing Republican proposal that ties interest rates to the financial markets is also under consideration. That plan has attracted some bipartisan support and is similar to a bill passed by the House last month.
Mr. President.
Senator from Florida.
Mr. President, I ask consent that the quorum be lifted.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I want to speak about the immigration bill that we passed a couple of weeks ago. It was a significant achievement. I have already congratulated all of those in the so-called Gang of Eight who put together the initial draft, and it was an example of how bipartisanship and recognizing that the other fellow has a point of view, that you respect that, and then you work out your differences. And that was an example of the Senate at its finest in what we ought to be doing on every piece of legislation around here. And the final result, 68 votes to 32 votes. Its prospects, we know not what, because of the different approach down in the House and the inability on so many things that we've passed here to go to the conference committee to iron out the differences between the House and the Senate. And so I am very appreciative, and I have given my congratulations to all of those who have participated in that immigration bill. There's a huge flaw. It's a huge flaw in not recognizing that when you want to secure the border, as supposedly was done in order to gain 14 Republican votes to get us to the huge vote of 68 votes for the bill, a major amount of money was added for border security. That's not the flaw, Mr. President. Some may question the amount of money. Indeed, there was $6.5 billion in the initial Gang of Eight compromise for border security, but when it came with the Corker-Hoven amendment, there was $46.3 billion, more of which over $44 billion was for border security. That's not what is the flaw, although you can argue it. The flaw is that the amendment that was offered by the senator from Mississippi and me was not even allowed to be considered, which was to increase not some $50+ billion for border security, which was the land border, but to add a mere $1 billion for maritime security. And that's the flaw. As a matter of fact, if you want border security, it is a fatal flaw. Why? You put up an impenetrable wall, whether it be a fence, an electric fence, an electronic fence, whether it be UAVs, more border patrol. As a matter of fact, in the Corker-Hoven amendment, $30 billion of that additional border security was just for Border Patrol agents, all of which are going to make it fairly effective in border security of not allowing people to pass. But it's the land border. So what is going to happen? You go right around the land border on the maritime border. It's either going to be on the West Coast, on the Pacific, or it's going to be on the East Coast, either the Gulf of Mexico and all the Gulf states or the Atlantic, including Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. Because if someone can be smuggled into one of them and therefore get an identity, then they have free access. Puerto Ricans are American citizens. They have free access to get to the rest of the U.S. So the maritime security becomes paramount, but you could not get people here who wanted to spend over $50 billion on border security, which is a land border, which in fact is in the bill, and they would not allow a Republican senator, Senator Wicker, and me to add $1 billion for maritime security. Now, specifically under our amendment, it would have addressed just that part of border security with regard to the Department of Homeland Security. But if you want an effective border security, you've got to then get into the whole host of things other than Customs and Border Patrol. You've got to get into additional resources for the Coast Guard. You've got to consider not only UAVs being flown by the Department of Homeland Security through Customs, et cetera, over the maritime border. You've got to put more Coast Guard out there. And I would suggest a new platform that would be very effective would be what the Navy is testing right now, which are blimps. It's a very cost-effective, long-dwell item that gives you enormous coverage at sea by one blimp. I have ridden in those blimps. Navy is testing them. I went with the Navy out of Fernandina Beach as they were doing the testing for Mayport Naval Station. It's incredible what you can do on the dwell time of a blimp. And, of course, the fuel used is de minimis. The cost of an entire mission for a blimp, some 24 hours of fuel, is the same of cranking up an F-16 and taxiing out to the runway. That amount of energy, fuel, spent is what you would spend on a blimp for an entire 24-hour period, as it is doing surveillance. So there's a combination that if we're going to be sincere about border effectiveness, then in fact we're going to have to pay attention to the maritime border as well as the land border. Now, why are Senator Wicker and I concerned about this? Well, he comes from a Gulf Coast state, Mississippi. I come from the state that has the longest coastline of any state save for the state of Alaska. And my state of Florida has some over 1,500 miles of coast. It is a place that will be a haven for smugglers of people and drugs. If we think we are tightening up border security by over $50 billion being applied to the land border, where are the smugglers going to go? They're going to go right around. It's just like water will flow and it will meet the place of least resistance, and it will continue to flow. So too will the smugglers. So, Mr. President, I want to say that I'm disappointed that people on that side of the aisle would not allow Senator Wicker's and my amendment to be considered. In the last minute, it's not controversial, and yet, for whatever reason, it was denied. I hope as we proceed on the immigration bill, and I hope we are able to proceed if the House will act, I hope in the final product that it will be considered and added so that we can really have a secure border, a maritime border, as well as a land border. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Senator from Iowa.
Soon we'll be voting on a district court nominee. So I rise in opposition to the nomination of Jennifer Dorsey. That's for the U.S. District Judgeship, District of Nevada. Before I outline the basis for my opposition, I want to inform my fellow senators and American people regarding facts on judicial nominations. We continue to hear from my colleagues on the other side of the aisle about how we're obstructing nominees or treating this president different. Those complaints are without foundation, and I'll quantify my answer to prove my point. There is no crisis in the manner in which we're confirming nominees. This is all part of a larger strategy to justify breaking the rules of the United States Senate to change the rules of the United States Senate. The fact is that after today, the Senate will have confirmed 199 lower court nominees. We have defeated 2. That's 199 to 2. So who can complain about that record? The success rate happens to be 99% for the nominees considered on the floor of the United States Senate sent up here by President Obama. We have been doing it at a very fast pace as well. During the last Congress, we confirmed more judges than any Congress since the 103rd Congress. That Congress sat 93 through 94. This year, we've already confirmed more judges than were confirmed in the entire first year of President Bush's second term. So far this year, we have confirmed 27 judges. If confirmed today, Ms. Dorsey will be the 28th confirmation this year. So let's compare this with a similar stage, which would be President Bush's second term, when only 10 judicial nominees have been confirmed. So we're now at a 28 to 10 comparison with President Obama clearly ahead of where President Bush was concerned, but somehow we're hearing complaints. And as I said, we've already confirmed more nominees this year, 28, than we did during the entirety of the year 2005, the first year of President Bush's second term, when 21 lower court judges were confirmed. After today, only 3 Article III judges remain on the Senate's executive calendar, 2 district nominees and 1 circuit nominee. Yet, we hear the same old story. Somehow, our friends on the other side of the aisle, the Senate majority, the Senate Democrats, cite this as evidence of obstructionism. Compare that to calendar year June 2004, when 30 judicial nominations were on the calendar, 10 circuit, 20 district, and somehow I don't recall any Senate Democrat complaining about how many nominations were piling up on the calendar. Nor do I remember protests from my colleagues on the other side that judicial nominees were moving too slowly. Some of those nominees had been reported out of committee more than a year earlier, and most were pending for months. And some of them, you know, never did get an up or down vote. The bottom line is that the Senate is processing the President's nominees exceptionally fairly, and I don't know why that message can't get through, but it's excuse to abuse the rules of the United States Senate to change the rules of the United States Senate. So President Obama certainly is being treated more fairly in the beginning of his second term than Senate Democrats treated President Bush in the first year of his last term in office. It is not clear to me how allowing more votes so far this year than President Bush got in an entire year amounts to, quote, unprecedented delays and obstruction, end of quote. Yet that is the complaint that we hear over and over and over again from the other side. So I just want to set the record straight, and it's a sad commentary that I have to spend so much time when figures speak for themselves, but set the record straight again before we vote on the nomination of Ms. Dorsey. I have concerns with this particular nominee. I think all members are aware of the press accounts of campaign contributions which were made at the time this nomination was under consideration. We have not received a full explanation of what happened. Nevertheless, I'm concerned about the appearances of these contributions and how such actions might undermine the public confidence that our citizenry must have in that judicial branch of our government. I also have concerns about Ms. Dorsey's qualifications to be a federal judge. She has no criminal law experience. She has participated in only 6 trials, 1 as a sole counsel, 1 as first chair, and 4 as second chair. I'm concerned that her lack of experience will be a problem when she gets to the bench. It is not surprising to me that the American Bar Association Standing Committee on the Federal Judiciary gave her a partial, not qualified rating. I'm also concerned with her understanding of the proper role of a judge. Now, while in law school, she wrote a note that praised the justices who wrote Roe v. Wade. She praised them for the willingness to, quote, forge ahead to create a just outcome without regard to the usual decisional restraint, end of quote. And then she, and further quote, the majority made the just decision and then forced history and stare decisis to fit with that decision, end of quote. Ms. Dorsey, understand this about her. Ms. Dorsey praised judges who made their decision, and I want to use her words, without regard to the usual decisional restraints. Now, those words are not the words that judges should be using, and not the kind of judges that we want. Those who are activist judges who impose their own policy preferences rather than in following enacted law or precedent. So, what do we want? We want judges who will be restrained by precedent and by the laws that Congress passes. Although Ms. Dorsey said that she no longer supports what she once wrote, I'm unconvinced that she will be able to lay her policy preferences aside when they conflict with the law dictates, what the law dictates she ought to do. For all those reasons I mentioned above, I cannot support the nominee. I have 2 news articles that describe the campaign contribution issue I discussed earlier, and I ask unanimous consent that those be entered in the record.
Without objection.
And I yield the floor and suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I rise today to say a few words about my friend who is leaving the Senate this week, Massachusetts Senator Mo Cowan. I have to admit it, when he first arrived, I was just excited because I was no longer going to be 100th in seniority. That job went to Mo, and I could be 99th. However, quickly after he was sworn in, I realized he was one of the nicest and smartest members of this body. During his recent farewell speech, Mo referred to me as the North Dakota sister he never knew he had. Well, I already have 6 siblings, but I would welcome him into the Heitkamp family any day. In all seriousness, Mo was an excellent addition to this body. After the Boston Massacre tragedy, he showed incredible leadership skills. He was a source of guidance and comfort to countless folks from Massachusetts in the weeks and months that followed that horrific act of terrorism. During his short tenure here, Mo has distinguished himself in this body. First, Mo listens more than he talks. His acute observation skills have made him a trusted advisor to many. But equally important, Mo's observations are without judgment. Rather, Mo listens and just tries to understand how we can advance the issue and not judge the speaker's motivations. But Mo is a serious thinker, always trying to find a path forward to resolve the important issues of our time. I can only imagine the important and great legislation Mo would have advanced had he had more time here. Although Mo is a serious guy, he also loves to laugh, mostly at his own expense. Mo's desk in the Senate was often the gathering site for many freshman senators because everyone was just a little happier and a little smarter after spending time with Mo. Mo is also an extraordinarily humble human being, not the false modesty of a seasoned politician, but the humility that comes from a deep faith and a lifetime of self-reflection. But you should never mistake that humility for a lack of self-confidence. Mo is very sure-footed and anchored in one great belief that his job is and always will be to make the world a more just place for his sons and for all the children of our country. So beyond the ritual of carving a name in a desk and as recorded roll call votes on important issues like immigration, what will be Mo Cowan's U.S. Senate legacy? History may mark his time here in a footnote, but Mo's impact has been much greater. I cannot speak for others in this body. Because I serve with Mo Cowan, I will be a better United States Senator. I will listen more and talk less. I will always remember not to judge the motivation of others, instead to seek solutions with others. And I will redouble my efforts to make our great country a more just place for our children. I will miss you, Senator Mo Cowan. You are a great United States Senator, but more importantly, you are a wonderful and kind human being. Thank you for our service to our country. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor and suggest the absence of floor.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
that the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I ask that the time be allocated back.
Without objection.
And Mr. President, I ask for the yeas and the nays to be counted.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The question is on the Dorsey nomination. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Ayotte, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Baucus, Mr. Begich, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Blumenthal,